Greetings, everyone. I hope you enjoy the lecture today. We're going to spend a bit of time talking about the Jourain article. I really like this article. I included it in the course because it offers a little bit of a different perspective, and we are taking up the issue of leadership and gender. So this article's particular approach to considering gender looks at what we might talk about as a non-binary notion of gender or trans identities. And so we are thinking about the relationship between normative gender construction and leadership ideals and identities. We're thinking about notions of heteronormativity and how that affects understandings of leaders and leadership. And of course, we're always keeping in the back of our mind sort of that normative white masculinity that is often what constructs the idea of an ideal leader and ideal leadership approaches. Before listening to and watching the rest of this lecture, what I'd suggest you do is watch the 4 video files. They're quite short that have been included for you on Avenue. One is a TED Talk, 2 are informational videos, and 1 is actually a definition that is read aloud from Wikipedia that brings to light notions of genderism. So have a look at those and then come back to the lecture. So authentic leadership is a particular model or approach to understanding leadership that often falls under the umbrella of transformational leadership perspectives. But of course, authentic leadership can be related or applied to in many different contexts using many different models. It's one of those nice little additional things that you can use to complicate understandings of leadership. So authentic leaders are understood as people who are relational. They engage in openness in the workplace, good communication. They are self-aware individuals, and they are concerned not only with themselves, but also with the people that they work with and for. And a transformational leader will concern themselves with the goals and ambitions of the people that they're leading and do what they can with the resources that they have to encourage those other people to develop leadership qualities and skills as well. Transformational leaders are also described as having a lot of self-awareness. I think I said that in the last slide. And this self-awareness comes through critical reflection and critical reflexivity. So it's a perspective that certainly ties into lots of the social work understandings that we talk about, even when we're talking about folks who are more concerned with direct service and practice. This self-awareness, this reflection, is understood to help the authentic leader reveal who they are to themselves, and then allows them to reveal it to others, and allows them to tap into parts of themselves that they might be less familiar with. They're also seen as people who have a highly developed moral conscience and who have a lot of integrity. Now, all of these perspectives or approaches have some critique. We know that post-structuralists, postmodernists argue that this idea of hidden aspects of the self is largely baloney, and that really what matters is context. People know themselves, who they are changes, the context that they function and operate within is what means or makes that change happen. And of course we know that post-liberalists would say integrity doesn't really matter. What matters is having a goal and then responding in the context to achieve the goal within the boundaries and limitations of that particular context. But traditional notions of authentic leaders draw on a liberalist perspective that honors integrity and consistency within moral dealings and understands the pursuit of self-awareness and understanding of self as fundamental aspects of successful leadership. The better you can do this, the better you can share who you are and be a successful, authentic leader. So all of this self-awareness and consistency and integrity is in part about leadership relationships. So leaders have followers or parallel leaders with whom they interact with. And so it's important for the leader to create positive relationships. That's what makes leadership happen. So Authentic leaders demonstrate or enact relationship through things like flexibility, being able to respond to people's needs in a variety of different ways, to being oriented to process and concerned with the interchange in relationship or the bidirectional nature of relationships. They're concerned with power sharing and the sharing of responsibility, credit, and opportunity. So power sharing is seen as more than a means to an end. It's about building relationships that are, well, authentic. And of course, when you demonstrate those kinds of behaviors, hopefully through your relationships, you will build trust with one another that can endure when times might be challenging within an organizational environment. Communication is a significant aspect of the relationship building process, and the authentic leader is a good communicator who has a balanced approach to communication and who can both listen and share. They also use communication as a tool for relationship building and as a tool for building self-awareness. The more you share, the more you listen, the more you know, the more you can make contextually bound decisions when you're working with particular people or dealing with particular situations. So communication is really the process through which relationships and trust are built, and these are fundamental to authentic leadership. So now that I've laid out some of the fundamental building blocks of the perspective, which you have heard and also read in the article, we also have to think about what happens when we introduce non-normative identities and understandings of self, or contexts that are less fixed or understandable to us. So new environments, emerging environments, and marginalized identities or non-normative identities. Well, the author suggests to us it gets a bit sticky here because doing all the things that make one an authentic leader might not be so easy. And the authentic person might not necessarily embrace or present these particular approaches or traits. Or they might not want to develop them as the theory says we can. So I guess we have to think about how we can still understand some kind of authenticity that might not show itself in exactly the normative way that the perspective or theory of authentic leadership delivers to us. So gender nonconformity or trans identity may be places where we see the notion of the authentic leader become quite complicated. And so Jourain invites us to think about how normative notions of gender are closely linked to correct kinds of leadership, or leadership that can be understood in this particular context as authentic. What happens when the person who is demonstrating the authentic leadership doesn't necessarily get recognized as a correct, desirable, wanted, embraced, normative kind of person? What happens when the authentic leader has a non-normative identity position? So many of the leadership perspectives that we've looked at get presented to us through stories or through narratives, where people tell stories about a great leader that they had or a great experience they had as a leader, or people tell their emerging stories of becoming a leader. And so Jourain invites us to think about how these kinds of normative narratives become other people's understandings of what is the correct and the desirable leader. And so Jourain invites us to think about how we can create counter-narratives or counterpunctual understandings of how gender and leadership might be related, and how or in what way trans identity can shape what authenticity looks like. And then that can be another genuine kind of authentic leadership. So Jourain takes this up within the context of trans identity, but we could center any other kind of marginal identity. We could talk about race, ability, we could talk about sexual orientation, we could talk about linguistic traditions, religious traditions, any marginalized identity could be analyzed in the same way that Jourain is taken up the perspective of trans identity. And while I say that, Jourain also invites us to think about the way in which gender identity and sexual identity or sexual orientation can get confounded sometimes. And so we could be talking about LGBT identities in leadership and not be talking about trans identities, and vice versa. And that sometimes people conflate these two notions of understanding, but that trans identity is unique and specific, and it needs to be considered in its place within the notion of authentic leadership. Transparency is understood as a fundamental aspect of relational leadership. And I can certainly think about some folks who are very open in their role as a manager or a leader. And then I can think of other people who are less open, and that sometimes the openness is perceived as a more welcoming perspective, or a kind of openness that means that they're open to other people, that they don't see themselves as separate and apart by virtue of their particular situation. But I've also worked in contexts where people have bad boundaries, and this notion of openness is actually a kind of excuse or explanation for getting all messed up in people's business in a way that maybe you don't want people to at work. So thinking about those ideas, Jourain invites us to think about what transparency actually means and how that might not be something that trans-identified people feel particularly comfortable engaging in within the context of a leadership environment. Trans-identified people experience marginalization, they experience oppression, they experience greater levels of violence just ambiently in the community. They often don't have their needs acknowledged or met, and they've often been misunderstood or misrepresented within the environments that they operate within on a daily basis. Some people talk about the notion of minority stress as explaining what this process is like. You know, it can be a lot of work to be a trans person, and I know that from research that we did with trans-identified patients who were seeking health care. And so if you've lived your life, or a significant portion of your life, in this kind of environment where you never quite know what's going to happen next, you might be much less likely to be transparent and open. It might not be safe, or it might not be wise. And so Jourain invites us to think about how this notion of transparency and openness may work against people in the trans community who are interested and want to serve as leaders. So I think this suggests that if you're taking up the mantle of authentic leadership as the way to be a leader, that there could really be some complications for trans-identified people if they're going to operate within that particular environment. So in this way, a leadership perspective that could present many opportunities for particular populations and really create an openness or an innovative approach to leadership, that in another context for another population, it can be something that forecloses the understanding of their success and capability as a leader. Epistemic or epistemological humility is a concept that invites us to think carefully about what ways of knowing we allow to become dominant and what ways of knowing become subservient or submissive to those dominant ways. So we could apply the notion of authentic leadership as a kind of epistemologically dominant understanding within a leadership context. But at the same time, we could see it as just one of the ways in which we can make meaning from the process of leadership, and that we don't necessarily have to have a dogmatic sort of adherence to its perspectives. There are things about the notion of authentic leadership that make a lot of sense in a lot of contexts, but in other contexts for other people, they work against them. So we should then look for other solutions to understanding those particular kinds of leaderships and those ways of being and doing and knowing about leadership. Jourain introduces the concept of genderism and invites us to think about alternatives to genderism and ways in which we can have a more fluid, more open understanding of gender and genderqueer identities and non-binary identities and the people who manifest those identities within their embodied selves. So the article is really, I think, a great challenge to thinking about a perspective that has a lot of merit and a lot of goodness in it, but that even in something that can be good and is considered quite progressive, that there can be ways in which it works against other contexts and other people. And that we can use the strengths of the perspective and our understandings of the challenges that it brings to think about new ways of understanding or developing perspectives that might help us continue to want to know about leadership and to want to know about the practices of leadership. So I hope that this was a helpful and informative lecture and a good read as articles go. And I'll look forward to connecting with you on Zoom.